Okay, so good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or in my case, actually good evening, because I'm in the United States. Thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar on transversal competencies and their assessment, perspectives from the Asia Pacific. This webinar is being organized by the NEQMAP Secretariat here at UNESCO Bangkok. And for any of you who may not be aware, NEQMAP is actually a regional network focused on learning assessment that's coordinated by UNESCO Bangkok, and which actually brings together a diverse range of organizations that are working on assessment and also curriculum issues throughout the Asia Pacific region. To date, actually, we have 45 members from 26 different countries and economies of the region. And NEQMAP, which was established 4 years ago, focuses on three main areas of work. One is research and analytical work on a broad range of topics in regard to assessment issues in the region. Secondly, knowledge sharing. So this webinar actually is one of the ways in which we do that in terms of bringing people together to share information and experiences. And then lastly, capacity development at both regional and national levels. So as part of our research work, actually, we've been increasingly concerned, I would say, over the last few years. I think all of us really, as a community in all of our different countries, on this issue of what we at UNESCO Bangkok call transversal competencies, but which many of you may refer to as 21st century skills. Some people call them non-cognitive skills or socio-emotional skills. There's many different labels. But I think there's increasingly throughout the world, not just in our region, a sense that these skills and competencies are really, really crucial for young people in our education systems to master. And I think even internationally, when we look at, for example, the Education 2030 agenda, and the SDG 4, which is focused on education, we see that on the one hand, learning as a whole is really, really at the center of the agenda. But then learning beyond the foundational skills of reading, writing, maths is actually now explicitly a part of this agenda, particularly when we look at the target 4.7, which makes reference to learning around areas such as global citizenship education, sustainable development. So really this area has been really on the agenda and increasingly a concern, I think, for all of our countries, as well as for organizations such as UNESCO and others that are working with countries. So there's been a lot of work around transversal competencies, some of which is actually from our office, from UNESCO Bangkok, where for the past 3 years or so, under another network that we coordinate called the Education Research Institutes Network, we started looking at transversal competencies and how some countries or jurisdictions of our region have integrated these in terms of their education, overall education policies, as well as in curriculum, as well as in teaching. And there's been a number of interesting findings encapsulated in 3 reports that were produced by this Education Research Institutes Network, which are all available online. But the area that was always kind of a bit of a gap, we would say, was always in terms of assessment, measurement, thinking about actually, even if transversal competencies, skills and competencies such as, for example, critical thinking or creativity or communication, or again, going back to global citizenship, even if these are explicitly deemed to be priorities when you look at overall education policy, even if they're integrated to a certain extent in national curricula, even if teacher training initiatives are trying to incorporate training teachers to teach these areas, there's still very little that's known in terms of how teachers, how schools, how systems in countries, really anywhere, but particularly in our region, actually try to measure and assess these skills and competencies. So bearing this in mind, actually, our network, NEQMAP, launched a study last year looking at this question, at transversal competencies and whether they're assessed and how they're assessed, looking at both system and school level perspectives in 9 different countries, jurisdictions of the Asia Pacific, which were Australia, Hong Kong, China, India, Malaysia, Mongolia, the Philippines, the Republic of Korea, Thailand, and Vietnam. So really a diverse group of countries, but the study actually revealed a number of interesting findings. Of course, each context, each country is quite different, but there were a number of commonalities that emerged as well. And so the report of this study, which was authored by Drs. Esther Kerr and Dr. Rebecca Lowe, was published and launched at the NEQMAP annual meeting that we held in December of last year. So some of you may have been at that meeting, or you may have since received a copy of the publication. But we're still trying very much to get the word out about some of the findings, and also to solicit input in terms of a next phase of this work and kind of where do we go from here, because it is such an interesting area, and I think countries are really, really interested in learning more about this. And so that's why we thought we would organize this webinar today. So just to run through how this is going to work, we have 2 speakers who I'll go ahead and just briefly introduce to you, although I think most of you may have seen the concept notes that we put together for today. So we have Dr. Esther Kerr, who, as I mentioned, was the primary author of this report and who coordinated this project for us. So Dr. Kerr is a senior research fellow at the Brookings Institute. And before this, for many years, she was a senior academic at the University of Melbourne. She was international research coordinator for a project that some of you may have heard of called the ATC 21S, or the Assessment and Teaching of 21st Century Skills. And she's done numerous projects and work in Australia, as well as different parts of Asia, on the integration of 21st century skills in both curriculum and assessment. She also serves as co-director of the Assessment, Curriculum, and Technology Research Center of the Philippines, which was one of the countries that participated in this study. And in her relatively new role at Brookings, she's doing a lot of very interesting work on this topic under the theme of breadth of skills, or skills for a changing world. And so it was really, really exciting for us that Dr. Kerr agreed to coordinate this research. And so she's going to be giving an overview presentation outlining the key findings and highlights from the research. And then we're also very honored to have Dr. Samuel Kai-Wah Chu, Sam Chu, from the University of Hong Kong. Dr. Chu is an associate professor at HKU in the Faculty of Education. And he's also the Deputy Director of the Center for Information Technology and Education in the same Faculty of Education. He was also head of the Division of Information and Technology Studies from 2013 to 2016. And he's doing a lot of interesting work around things like game-based learning, social media and education, and of course 21st century skills as well. So how we will proceed over the next hour or so, we were originally going to hear first from Dr. Kerr, followed by Dr. Chu, but actually we've had just a bit of technical difficulties, which I hope are being resolved now. So we're actually going to hear first from Dr. Chu to get the perspective of Hong Kong, because what I forgot to mention is that Dr. Chu was the country researcher and led the team for the Hong Kong case study on this topic, as Hong Kong was one of the 9 countries, or rather jurisdictions, that were involved. So first we'll hear from Dr. Chu, and then we'll hear from Dr. Esther Kerr, and then we'll have a Q&A session for about 20 minutes. But actually, in terms of submitting questions or comments, all of you are free at any time to actually use the chat function, which you can see at the bottom left of your screen under the icon that says I am. So you can just click that icon at any time, and while the presenters are speaking, and you can submit any question that you may have in writing, so that we'll have time at the end to address those. And also in terms of technicalities, if everyone can just please remember to always keep your microphone muted so that we don't get background noise, and also make sure that your video is switched off. So in theory, only the person who's speaking should have their microphone unmuted. So I hope I've covered all the background and the technical aspects. I forgot to introduce myself, by the way. My name is Ramya Vivekanandan, and I'm based at UNESCO Bangkok, and I coordinate the NEQMAP Secretariat. So then, without further adu, Dr. Chu, Sam, are you ready to present?
Yes, thank you very much, Ramya, for the very nice introduction. So this is Sam. Good morning from Hong Kong. I'd like to first of all thank UNESCO colleagues for organizing this webinar. I'll share with you what we've learned regarding transversal competencies and their assessment in Hong Kong. Oh, let me see. I should open my PowerPoint. Okay, now, so I hope the audience can see the PowerPoint that I'm showing. If there's any problem, please let us know. And I'd like to acknowledge the excellent assistance again from my two highly capable assistants, Jennifer and Karen, in preparing this. Kindergarten education is offered to children aged 3 to 5. Primary schooling starts at the age of 6, and there are 6 years of schooling at this level. On completion of secondary 6, students take a public exam, which can be viewed as the university entrance exam. Education Bureau in Hong Kong designed 8 key learning areas, KLA, for primary and secondary students. The 8 KLAs provided context for the development and application of generic skills as well as values and attitude. I just want to check and see if everything is going fine. Ramya, is everything okay?
Everything is fine. We can see the presentation. We can hear you.
Okay, excellent. Yeah. So also the audience can hear me and also can view my PPT.
As far as we know, yes. We haven't received any messages saying the contrary.
Good. All right. Then I'll just continue then. I quite like the KLAs. For example, I agree that physical education should be a key learning area for primary as well as secondary students. However, this policy guideline from Education Bureau, EDB, hasn't been followed closely by many schools. Besides being a professor in my university, I'm also the warden of an undergraduate hall residence in my university. Every year, I run with many 18, 19-year-old male students, of course also female students. I'm always surprised that I can beat over half of the male students. I'm not a particularly strong runner, so you can tell that very few schools in Hong Kong are actually following this guideline, making physical education a key learning area. Now, the first column on the left are the TVC domains proposed by UNESCO. Transversal competencies are termed as generic skills under the framework proposed by EDB, the Education Bureau in Hong Kong, which are similar to those proposed by UNESCO. The skills should be developed through different learning activities in KLA's key learning areas. However, teachers, especially primary school teachers, may not have sufficient training for teaching students these generic skills, particularly critical thinking, creativity, problem-solving skills, and information and technology skills. For example, a few years ago, a primary general studies teacher, like a social study teacher, told me that although he has led upper primary students through an inquiry group project for 2 whole years, he still doesn't know how to properly guide the students through such projects. Why is it so difficult? Because an inquiry project is essentially a research. I suspect that many teachers did not receive proper training on doing a research when they were in university. That's why when they are now asked to lead students through a small research, it becomes a difficult task to them. For my UNESCO case study in Hong Kong regarding TVCs, we interviewed some colleagues in EDB's Curriculum Development Council for the system level. For the school level, we interviewed 5 principals, vice principals in primary and secondary schools, and we interviewed 10 teachers from the participating schools. In Hong Kong, TVC assessment is included in EDB's policy framework and guidelines. EDB tries to integrate TVC assessment into the Hong Kong education system through providing aids for teaching and assessment, as you can see on the left, and teaching and training, and lastly, research, the one at the bottom. One Hong Kong example is the introduction of a pedagogy that guides upper primary students through an inquiry group project with support from a team of teachers. You can see the team of teachers here. The project is led by the general study teacher and supported by the school librarian in teaching students information literacy. The students are also supported by the language, in this case Chinese, and ICT teachers, so that they are well equipped with ability in reading, writing, and relevant ICT skills for their project. Under this pedagogy, students score 38% higher when compared to students a year ago. Besides, they improve in 12 core competencies, including reading, writing, problem-solving abilities, and information and IT literacies. To learn more about this pedagogy, you can consult these 2 books. You can find more information about them at this website. EDB adopted the school-based curriculum development approach in Hong Kong. Schools and teachers have the autonomy to develop their own guidelines based on the needs of schools and students. This creates opportunities for schools to enhance curriculum leadership and promote a culture of collaboration among teachers. For example, for Tsuen Wan Government Secondary School, TWGSS, they have been collaborating with me in implementing a plagiarism-free inquiry project-based learning pedagogy that has effectively enhanced students' project quality and lowered the level of plagiarism in their work. Their students have been getting top awards from Hong Kong for some of their projects. Their teachers have been giving seminars about the pedagogy for teachers and educators on various occasions. And the liberal studies, language, and science teachers shown here work collaboratively on the new pedagogy. To learn more about this pedagogy, you can look at this book, also available at the same website that I showed you in previous slide. And this is the plagiarism-free inquiry project-based learning pedagogy, UPCC. U stands for we need to help students to understand what is plagiarism, which is not that easy to understand actually. And P, paraphrase, includes paraphrasing, synthesizing, and summarizing sources students consult for their inquiry project learning. And then the first C is learn how to cite things properly using some online freely available citation tools. And then the last C is to teach students how they can self-check the originality, whether there's any plagiarized material in their group project work by using some online plagiarism checking software. The implementation of the school-based curriculum development in Hong Kong is problematic because there seems to be no monitoring from the system level, the EDB, and therefore the quality of the implementation varies. For example, not all school leaders disseminate system-level policy to teachers. Schools in Hong Kong have integrated TVC assessments in different ways. For example, there are schools that incorporate assessment in specific subjects or cross subjects, and there are soft integration. That is, no particular deliverables by students for assessment, but having TVCs as embedded skills infused in curriculum and lesson delivery. All schools in our study have plans to include TVC assessment reporting as part of their academic subjects reporting, and some are already doing a good job. For example, here's the rubrics for grading students' inquiry group project in TWGSS, the local secondary school that tries to assess students' abilities in various TVCs, including information and media literacy and critical thinking and others. Here's an example for how a local primary school asks its upper primary students to peer assess their group members, and they also need to conduct self-reflection. This can enhance students' interpersonal and intrapersonal skills. Our study shows that teachers in Hong Kong have a high level of awareness of both system and school-level mandates on TVC's assessment. However, there are some issues related to policy documentation. Teachers felt that there wasn't sufficient information provided to them, and there's a lack of clear communication protocols. Regarding TVC assessment, there's a split in the teachers' response. Half of the teachers look at how students approach and work through an activity. The other teachers focus on students' correct solution to their problems or task completion. With Wikiglass, a learning analytic tool for visualizing the statistics of collaborative wikis built by secondary school students during their inquiry group project-based learning, teachers at TWGSS find it easier to monitor students' work and provide assessment for learning regarding students' TVCs. A teacher in another school, however, said, critical thinking is just part of exercise. Literacy skills are the real assessments. For the first domain of TVC, critical and innovative thinking, TWGSS is doing an excellent job in encouraging students to become entrepreneurs. Since 2012 and 2013, they have set up an award with help from their alumni to enable students to create innovative products. And this scholar down here suggests that creativity can actually be taught by providing students with choice and exploratory learning, emphasizing on encouraging students' intrinsic motivation. A secondary 4 students at TWGSS, Mr. Lau Chun Hei, representing Hong Kong SAR, presented his invention, door stopper hinge, at an international convention at Saudi Arabia in 2013 and won the Saudi Arabia Invention Award. For the second domain of TVC, interpersonal skills, schools can help students develop good communication and collaboration skills through doing inquiry group project work. This is a secondary school liberal studies group project that examines the problem of sitting with legs crossed. So check whether you are having your legs crossed. Well, it's saying that if you do that a lot, you are actually killing yourself. The students spend 5 months working on the project, and they need to present their work at the end. The students in TWGSS produce some of the best inquiry group project work in Hong Kong, and they won awards every year. Through such serious group project work, no doubt that students learned a lot about communication and collaboration skills. For the third domain, intrapersonal skills. A good way to develop this is to create an incentive for students to learn on their own. The rubrics, commitment to learn, created by this IFS Academy, a primary and a secondary school in Hong Kong, provide a measure of students' effort beyond academic achievements. Reading Battle is a gamified online e-quiz platform of children's literature. It's effective in motivating students to learn to read independently. Many primary students in Hong Kong have persevered in their reading and in answering questions regarding books they have read on the platform. And quite a few of them have read hundreds of books, as you can see. The top 4 here actually have read over 400 books and achieve a high score from the e-quizzes. And remember, this is learning independently, basically, by the students. So if you want to learn more about this, you can go to this website. Some local primary schools have developed different self-evaluation forms, like this one, as part of the assessment of project work to encourage students' self-discipline and self-awareness. For the fourth domain, global citizenship, moral and civic education, TWGSS asked students to do group works on different moral and civic issues. The group projects provide students with opportunities to examine global or moral issues. And this secondary 3 student group investigate the legalization of organ selling. For the fifth domain, media and information literacy of TVC, Hong Kong Federation of Youth Groups, a non-profit organization helping youth to grow up, has been providing training for secondary students on media and information literacy education. And this is part of a media and information literacy course. And here talks about what is new media. And by the way, I'm involving in it as a consultant. And this book provides a collection of more than 20 lesson plans for teaching media literacy education in Hong Kong. One school shares its lesson plan on the topic, trustworthiness of news. Well, as we all know, especially these days, there are lots of news on the TV, on the internet, they are not that trustworthy. Whether they are from the US or from other parts of the world, is same thing. So media literacy is really important. Okay, anyway, lastly, take away from this sharing. Now, although on the surface, Hong Kong seems to be doing quite a few innovative things that you may be impressed regarding the teaching and evaluation of TVCs. It, in fact, has many problems prevalent underneath. First, do school leaders have the knowledge and skills in effectively incorporate TVC teaching and assessment using the whole school approach? I'm afraid not in many cases. For example, a few years ago, the principal in a pretty strong academic primary school in Hong Kong requested the implementation of inquiry project-based learning in all courses. This policy basically drove the teachers, students, and their parents crazy, as they were not ready for something like this. But teachers actually are not well equipped to teach inquiry project-based learning. And many of the tasks were found to be too difficult, not just for the students, and even for the parents who try to help. As a result, quite a few parents decided to withdraw their children from the school. Second, teachers seem to be lacking the knowledge in understanding what are TVCs, what learning outcomes should they expect from students in teaching TVCs, and how to assess them. Finally, there are other problems, such as large class size, that makes it difficult to assess students and manage their progress effectively. The focus on academic success in Hong Kong is driving students, parents, and teachers crazy. And the pressure is just too high for quite a few students. And sadly, many, especially in recent 1 or 2 years, end their lives in suicide. So there's still a lot for Hong Kong educators, teachers, and parents to learn regarding what is learning, what is education, and why TVCs are so important, and how to teach and assess them properly. Thank you. That's all for my presentation. Ramya.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Sam, Dr. Chu, for a very comprehensive and interesting presentation. I thought that the challenges that you highlighted at the end were particularly interesting because for those of us who may not know very well the Hong Kong context, one could mistakenly presume that, that things may be easier there in terms of integrating and teaching and assessing these competencies. But your research, the case study that you did, proves that indeed there are many challenges even in a context like Hong Kong. So thank you very much for sharing. For anyone who for some reason maybe was not able to view the presentation, not to worry. Everyone who is participating in the webinar or who registered in the webinar will be sending an email with all of the presentations after we conclude. So not to worry about that. Then without further ado, Esther, are you now connected and online?
Esther, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you, but I don't know that you can hear me.
We
Yes,
can hear you.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Yes, we can.
Great. Fantastic.
We're going to try
And can
to
you see me?
show your presentation while you speak, so let us try this really quickly. Present PowerPoint.
So if you can do it, that's great. And if not, I've got it here on the phone, but it's not optimal.
Should be loading.
Okay.
Do you see it loading? Okay. Can you see?
How many presented?
Okay, Esther, can you see the screen?
Yes. No, I've just got a black screen with the, the thing sort of looping around as though it's trying to load, but can't quite manage it. Oh, something is starting to appear now. Is that what I've just got a little tiny bit in the top of my screen?
Yeah.
It just says loading.
It seems like the loading has stopped.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well,
Okay, I mean, it doesn't actually matter if I can see the screen or not. I can just move you on from one slide to the other. Is that a good way to go?
no, it doesn't look like we're able to load your presentation at all. So I think you'll have to.
Oh, I see.
And then we'll share your presentation following.
Well, okay, look, I'll just, I don't know whether I can do it from the phone to do a share screen, and I'll try to do that.
Okay. We're now on page 1 of the webinar.
Yeah, it doesn't look as though I can share screen from the phone, so I'll need to leave it over to you. Does that mean that the participants cannot see any slides?
So far, it's not working to present the presentation, so I think we'll just have to do an audio presentation now and share the webinar slides.
Okay, and if anything gets better during the time, then that's great.
I can see it.
Oh, I see. Okay. Do you see it now, Mark? Okay, I think we should just begin with your audio presentation.
Let's just go ahead.
If you could begin, Esther.
Okay, lovely. Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody, and it's really unfortunate that our technologies are not working too well, so I'll try to be really specific as I work through the slides and what I wanted to say. So as you will have heard from Dr. Chu and earlier on from Ramya, we undertook this study to look at existing policies and practices around the assessment of transversal competencies. And in each of the countries that Ramya went through before, we had teams or individuals who actually did the field work. This was from late 2015 through to 2016. And so in terms of what I want to talk about today, I'm just going to describe the study briefly and then talk about the main findings and talking about what the overall picture of the general responses were and what they lead to. Things like need for resources, aware of guidelines around how we deal with transversal competencies in education, what the purposes for assessment might be, and what some of the challenges are. And then I want to move to the future and the recommendations about where we might go as a region from here, and talking about some specific activities. So first off, we do know that there is a global movement in education taking up the idea of transversal competencies. Whether you call it 21st century skills or breadth of skills doesn't really matter. And what this means is we're looking at a much more explicit focus on students acquiring skills as well as content knowledge during their education, so that they're better able to adapt and move much more constructively through both their study life and their working life. Now, when I say that we do know there's a global movement, we've got quite a few sources of evidence now. And so, for example, the studies that were undertaken by AreaNet over the last 3 or 4 years is one source of evidence for the region. And then a second source of evidence is a desk work mapping activity that we undertook at Brookings over the last year. So from AreaNet, that was looking at the Asia Pacific, they finished or went through 3 phases. They looked at whether transversal competencies were reflected in education policy and practice. They looked at school and teaching practices in their second phase, and they looked at preparation and support for teachers in their third phase. And then this particular study that we're talking about today, the NEQMAP study, was about assessment of the transversal competencies. So from those studies, we know very well in the Asia Pacific region that countries are very much aware of the need for their students to develop these skills. From the Brookings side, we've done a mapping of 113 countries, and there's a new update with some more countries coming out at the end of this month. And what we found there is it doesn't really matter whether you're looking at low socioeconomic or income, middle income or high income countries. This trend is happening everywhere. And so what this tells us is, yes, there's a movement to a little bit of a reconfiguration, a changing of education, but then we need to think about what does that mean in terms of how we reflect this movement in curriculum and how we reflect the movement in pedagogical practices, and how do we reflect this movement in assessment and approaches to assessment. And that was really the focus, of course, of this study. And so in this study, we wanted to find out whether there were existing policies and practices around assessment of the competencies. We wanted to find out if there were any big challenges in the assessment of them. And we wanted to look at ideas and recommendations for how we might move forward, particularly in the Asia Pacific. So we did this research at 3 different levels. At system level, where we wanted to look at whether policy was reflecting assessment of the competencies. And then we went to school level, and within the school levels, we worked both at leadership level and at teacher level. And the data sources that we used were primarily interviews and focus group discussions. One of the countries also undertook some observations in classes. One of the things to be aware of across our countries is that there was no attempt to sample schools on a representative basis. So the schools were selected by each country's research team on a number of different criteria. It could have been merely the schools that put up their hands to participate. It might have been that the system or the researchers nominated particular schools that were interested in transversal competencies. It could have been that there were high-performing schools that were interested in participating. So that's just something to be aware of, that we don't necessarily, or we don't, have a representative sample for the study. But we have some schools and systems that are aware of what's happening in the world, and we've got a little bit of a picture about how they're responding to it. So from Sam's presentation, you will have seen the particular skills that we were looking at. So 5 big categories of skills. critical and innovative thinking, and that includes things like creativity, resourcefulness, reflective thinking, decision making. Interpersonal skills, and that picks up on communication, organisational, teamwork and so on. Media and information literacy skills, about analysis of information through ICTs. Global citizenship, which is a very interesting composite of skills, as well as things that are not skills, things like tolerance, ethics, values and so on. Intrapersonal skills, which is around self-discipline, ability to learn, flexibility, adaptability and so on. And then another group of skills that we called other. Now these sets of skills were the ones that were developed through the ERINET phases of the study, and we've used those as a nice way of framing the work that's happened since that time. So in terms of how we went, or how the country teams went about collection of data, they looked at documents that were available at policy and system levels, for example, assessment guidelines, and they also looked at some implementation records. The other main sources of information were interviews, and that's interviews both with people at central level in education systems, as well as interviews at the leadership level within schools and teachers within schools. And similarly, questionnaires were completed by these people. So they're the data sources. So what that really meant in the end is that we ended up at system level with documentation about what was available around assessment of TVCs, Transversal Competencies. At school level, from the leadership group, we looked for documentation and information about policy. We looked for information around support and infrastructure. We looked at strategic plans and any issues that emanated from those. For the teacher level, again, we looked at what was available at policy level. So we're interested in, if there's a policy at central system level, does that policy penetrate down to school leadership? And then after that, does it penetrate actually down to the teacher who's interfacing with the classroom? From the teacher, we also were wanting to look at their understandings about alignment between assessment and types of assessment and uses of assessment as against what they were trying to teach. So if, for example, you're teaching maths, there might be an appropriate way for assessment of maths. If we're teaching something like collaboration, then what is an appropriate method to use for assessment of collaboration? So we wanted to see if there was any awareness of those sorts of issues. And again, we asked the teachers about what they saw as available to them in terms of support and infrastructure. So we get the view of what the leadership of the school thinks is being provided, as well as the teacher's perspective about what's coming through. And we're also interested in their attitudes and beliefs about transversal competencies and their place in the education system, and the availability and use of particular assessment tools. So I have a nice little image here that you can't see, but hopefully when you look at the PowerPoint later on, you can have a look at this. So this particular screen is entitled Questionnaire and Spreadsheet Examples. And in this, we've just given a couple of images of some of the questionnaire and survey tools that we used. And from this in particular, it becomes very clear to the reader that we had very similar questions, and in some cases exactly the same question, across the different levels, the system level, the school leadership level and the teacher level. And this was so we can really get some sort of a triangulation of the data in the sense that are the perceptions of each of these groups the same about these particular issues? It's quite reasonable, of course, that at different levels in any organisation, you're going to have personnel having different views about what happens. And even you're going to have different views about what is available. And where there's a discrepancy, and in some of the results there definitely were discrepancies, then we need to think about why are they happening? And we hypothesized for the study that where we're finding those discrepancies between the views about resources or training or whatever it might be between teachers and school leadership and system, that this might be attributable to the fact that this movement toward transversal competencies is in its very early stages, and so it's probably not flowing out very smoothly at the moment. And the other thing is, of course, it might be about different communication structures and maybe communication across different parts of a very large bureaucratic system are not always the best. So that would be identified as one of the challenges, that we need to have communication running pretty well when you've got a mainstream sort of reform happening. So the general responses, so I'm just moving here a little bit more now into talking about the results in a more generic way than Sam did, but in what I talk about, you'll see that there are very clear alignment between some of the within-country results, as for Hong Kong, as well as, of course, for the general. One of the things to be aware of, though, is that we did find strong country differences in some areas. So in the general responses, at the system and the policy level, overall, over all the countries, we did not find assessment guidelines that were particularly specific to transversal competencies. There might be mention of the need for assessment. There might be, a little bit of information or discussion about it, but in terms of sort of specific guidelines that would really help a school leader or a teacher, overall, there was not a great deal of that sort of information. So what that led to is that the systems were basically providing very broad guidelines that assessment should occur through, as Sam said, the key learning areas, the KLAs. So it should occur through key learning area exams, should occur through projects such as project-based learning. It should occur through use of different formative assessment strategies, and it should occur through teacher surveys. But those guidelines were really pretty broad. And those findings were very much reflected at the school and the teacher level, where both the school leadership and the teachers were saying, well, really, we didn't get very specific guidelines about how to assess, and we really don't have a great deal of understanding about how to develop this. So although, as with Sam's experience in Hong Kong, particular schools might make really solid, strong and innovative efforts to implement assessment of transversal competencies, at the system and national level, it does not appear at the moment that there's a great deal of consensus about what that should look like. And as indicative of that lack of consensus, we find that a majority of the teachers were requesting additional training and additional resources for them to embark on transversal competencies assessment. One of the things to be aware of is that these are very general findings, and within each country, of course, you'll find particular countries as well as particular schools within countries that might be absolutely fine and have a very clear vision. But overall, the picture is not that. There's an acknowledgement that they need to assess, but not necessarily a very clear message about how that assessment should be implemented. And that particular perspective was very much reflected in identification of the need for resources. So when we asked the teachers in particular about whether they had access to assessment resources, there was only one country that absolutely just said, yes, we've found materials and guidance, and didn't indicate that those materials were insufficient, did not indicate that they were looking for more and hadn't found them, or anything like that. So just the one country that said, yep, we know where the materials are and we can find them. The other countries varied in terms of their identification of need for resources. So some For example, Hong Kong, actually, since Hong Kong's sort of topical for this session, there are a couple of countries who had a very similar pattern where they said, yes, we found resources, but they were not sufficient. And so for both Hong Kong and Vietnam, that was the overall response from respondents, that, yep, they found some, but they still would like a little bit more. And then there were some countries that said, well, yes, we've been looking, but we haven't found anything particularly useful. And 50% of respondents in, for example, India and Malaysia responded in that way. So, and what's encouraging about that is that they were looking for it. The fact that one has not found it is unfortunate, but we have that motivation and that stimulus to actually look for resources. So again, when you see the PPT, you can look at these charts that I've just been reading from. That's the need for resources chart. Quite apart from the teachers saying they need more resources, you know, we're looking for other sources of evidence that imply that in fact the teachers do need support. And one of those that we picked up from identifying whether teachers were aware of assessment guidelines. And so we asked two questions here. One was, are teachers aware of general assessment guidelines? So moving right away from transversal competencies, just looking at assessment in general. And many countries have assessment frameworks. They have assessment guidelines, you know, whether this is by, with, from learning, all that sort of thing, or whether it's actually much more specific schedule information about assessments and the style of assessment. So of those who responded across all countries, 72% of the teachers said that they were aware of general assessment guidelines. So that's good. On the one hand, you can say, well, you know, you've got 28% who say, hey, no, we're not, which is a little bit concerning. The second question was, are you aware of assessment guidelines specifically around transversal competencies? And here, just 57% of teachers said they were aware of such guidelines. Now, going back to the point I made right at the beginning, that doesn't mean that those guidelines were particularly specific or detailed, but they did exist. Now, if we think about the difference between 72% of teachers being aware of assessment guidelines in general and 50% and 57% being aware of assessment guidelines specific to TVC, we can see that there is a pause here. You know, that gap implies something is on its way, but it hasn't reached mainstream practice. At least that's the interpretation or the hypothesis that I have about the findings. The other issue that is concerning and should make us think a little bit is around the purpose of assessment of transversal competencies. And I think this is a big conversation that we need to have across the region. We've accepted assessment in traditional academic areas for a very long time as a way of, I guess, identifying whether what is intended to be taught has been taught and whether students have learned that and are able to move on to further levels in their education. Here, where we're talking about the capacity to acquire skills that you can apply in new and different environments that you've never experienced before, assessment is very difficult in its own right. The second point we've got to think about is, well, why would we want to assess transversal competencies in the classroom? And when the teachers were asked this question, they identified the purposes of transversal assessment as being both for instructional purposes as well as for grading purposes. And also many respondents said that assessment was for both purposes, both for instruction and for grading. And I think those of us in education realise that although a lot of assessments can be used for both purposes, not all styles of assessment lend themselves readily to both purposes. So there's some untangling to be done in terms of teachers identifying how they might use assessment of transversal competencies, particularly in the context of the fact that they don't really understand yet, many of them, how to go about it. One country, for example, Mongolia, said that they were using transversal competency assessment primarily for instruction. Another country, Australia, said that they were using it both for instruction and for grading. So, you know, we've got a little bit of a mix here, and we need to be thinking about, well, what style of assessment is best suited for summative purposes? What style is best suited for instructional? And if we are actually assessing for instructional purposes, then that implies that we really need to be teaching those competencies. And then that goes to that next issue of, well, what are the pedagogical strategies that best can be used for instruction? And how do we adapt, revise, review our curricula to ensure that the competencies are actually interwoven within the curriculum and within some of the historic areas? I think I'm almost talking for a little bit too long, so I'll just move along pretty quickly here. So we've got a few possible contradictions in the data as well. We've got a majority of the teachers who are saying that they do use TVC assessment and that they have changed their teaching practices accordingly. On the other hand, and I think this is pointed out by Sam as well, although many teachers say they focus on how students approach their work, which would be absolutely in alignment with transversal competencies, half of the teachers were saying they actually focus on the correct solution and on whether students complete their tasks. Now, focusing on correct solution, focusing on task completion are very much more assessment modes that are aligned with traditional content and knowledge-based approaches. So there's a little bit of an anomaly or possible contradiction here, which might imply that teachers don't really get it yet about, and not only the teachers, but it's not coming through the school leadership system and it's not coming from central about what the real implications of taking on a breadth of skills agenda in education is for. So the challenges we're facing are, and again Sam mentioned this, that transversal competencies are not well understood. The skills themselves are not well understood. If we're going to integrate skills throughout a school, then you need a whole school agenda about this, where you've got the history teachers, the geography, the maths, the science, the English, the arts, all on the same page about it. And for that, you need synthesis right through the schools of the approach to assessment of them. We have some hurdles to get over. In many countries, we have exams-oriented cultures, and exams typically do reward correct answers. So how do we deal with taking on a new phenomenon like skills, which really isn't about getting a correct answer? It's about being adaptive and being agile and being flexible and responding. So how do we bring these two very different sorts of cultures together? Mm-hmm. And then for the teachers, there are obvious capacity issues, and these capacity issues are related to, again, this lack of understanding about the nature of skills. And so what that means is that right through the system, we need a great deal more research about the nature of the skills, how to teach, how to assess them. So I'm just going to move past the categories of challenge. Sam mentioned those. He talked about some of the operational and systemic challenges that occur in Hong Kong, and they were pretty typical across the whole board. But we have big definitional challenges. You know, what is a country's educational philosophy? And if it's an exam-oriented approach to education, how does that have to shift in order to accommodate these new priorities in where we want to move? In terms of recommendations, out of the report, which I hope some of you have read maybe, we recommended that we need policy decisions around those definitional issues, and that we need more research about the nature of the skills and their development in order to start to populate curricula, teaching and pedagogy and assessment. And we recommended that we work on that at a regional level. Since so many different countries are dealing with precisely the same issues, it doesn't make a great deal of sense for each of us to go off in our own way, when maybe if we all come together, we can get through this stage more efficiently, more constructively, and collaboratively. From the research, if we understand a little bit more about those skills, then we can start talking about pre-service and in-service teacher training. And with teachers more aware of what skills are and their impact on teaching and learning, then they are going to be in a better position themselves to develop materials and resources. It would be much better if some of the development of this work comes from the teaching force itself, rather than something that is pushed down from above. So we really do need to get that teacher education and training happening so that we can develop materials that are going to be useful for our students in the future. So specific activities, I guess, I don't know, Ramru might want to pick up on this a little bit, but what's being planned at the moment is a major initiative starting this year, 2017, going through to 2019, with a focus on the Asia Pacific and around assessment of transversal competencies. And what we're wanting to do in this specific activity stream is to look much more at how do we develop assessments of transversal competencies for use at different levels within an education system. And so one of the decisions that we'll want to make in the region is, should we start first looking at classroom level about how teachers themselves can start putting together assessment tools that they can use to help their instruction, for example? Or are countries more interested in actually picking up on national level tools? What we need is some identification of what particular assessment approaches are best used for instruction, and what type of assessment approaches might best be used for summative level reporting if it's decided that that's important. So to actually deal with these big questions, working in a regional group seems to me a very good way to go. So this particular initiative will have 3 major activities in it. The first will be region level workshops and symposia that will look at some of the assessment issues, going to the basics about what assessment is for and how assessments might vary. Then looking at what skills might we want to focus on to pretty much like a proof of concept. If we pick a couple of skills and start working on assessment approaches for those, then that might model approaches that countries can use later on for other skills. And then we are wanting to work with a cluster of 2 or 4 countries that will work intensively on the development of some transversal competency assessments. And again, these should act as a proof of concept for other countries within the network to start using as a modelling process for them to be thinking about how are they going to deal with the issue of assessment of transversal competencies in this decade. So thank you. I'll stop at that point and look forward to any discussion. And I want to thank you particularly on behalf of the country teams who put all of the work into gathering the evidence that brought us to the sorts of conclusions that I've outlined today. Thank you.
I understand that there are some questions.
Yes. Where can you? Hello. Hope you can hear me. Thank you, Esther. This is Nadia. Thank you, Esther, for providing such a comprehensive and interesting presentation. Actually, indeed, eventually we were able to share your PowerPoint file with everyone as you went on. So hopefully everyone was able to see that. Yeah, that was a good thing. So I think we have a number of questions coming in. I can see them on the chat box. So probably we can go ahead with the ones that came to Dr. Sam Chu. Then
Sure.
we'll move on to Esther, those related to Esther. Okay, what is the question? Present your presentation. Slide. Okay, there's one question for Dr. Chu saying in the last slide, there's a student depression and suicide. How it happens? It from overloaded for student?
Okay, I guess that there can be a number of reasons, but my observation and also from what I heard from my daughter, she's still a secondary school student, is that students in fact are having more and more homework and also more and more exercise and tests at schools, and that pressure is just too high for many kids. And then on the other hand, some parents they may think when their kids become teenager age of around say 15, then that they want them to focus more on academic rather than pursuing other interests, like one of the TVC listed that include sports and maybe others ability like say music's appreciation or playing some musical instrument, and so they just cannot relieve their stress, and so I do feel that the schools, I guess at least primary school, if possible, should follow many international schools that they eliminate all exams, so that the student can learn with a lot less pressure, and also that the TVCs, things like inquiry, project learning that we talked about earlier, can actually be taught effectively, and students can learn what we adults want them to learn more effectively through proper guidance with those inquiry projects, like the ones that I shared earlier in my slides. And then another question I got here talks about the rating of education in Hong Kong. Now some of you may know that there's something called PEARLS, which is an international reading ability test for kids age around 9, conducted every 4 or 5 years, and about 50 countries, economies participate in it last time, and Hong Kong ranked #1. But that's nothing to be proud of. In fact, I would hope that Hong Kong kids will rank much lower, so that they can enjoy life. One of my friends did a study a few years ago, and she told me an alarming result that students in Hong Kong, they have less time for exercise when compared to prisoners in Hong Kong. So the situation is that serious. And so, well, many countries actually send many people come to Hong Kong and try to learn how to become #1, how to become better in reading for their kids. Well, I think there's something good in Hong Kong, but overall the situation, as I mentioned in my last slide, is very unhealthy. And then let's see, another question. Let's see. Okay, another question about the process of TVC assessment, how the classroom practice to deliver TVC skills. Now, regarding that, for one of my slides, I shared that there's a couple books about 21st century skills that discuss this in detail, how different teachers can help students to develop different TVC skills, and some form of assessment are also provided in those books. So maybe you can take a look. And then I guess there's still one more question. Let's see. Oh, yeah, right. Can you elaborate on the reporting of TVCs in the Hong Kong school, either specific subject or cross subject? How does this reporting affect students' marks, grades? Okay, now for one of the slides, I showed the example from a school called TWGSS. That is the rubric for grading their students' inquiry group project work for the liberal study course. So it's like a social study course. And so some of the TVC skills are in fact given grades, and that contribute to part of the group project grades. I don't recall hearing from the teachers telling me that any students fail the TVC parts of their project. In fact, it's very hard to fail because, as I mentioned earlier, for that school, they basically guide students through their project for 5 whole months, and teacher did provide scaffolding support during the process. So it's very hard to fail. I think I'll stop here. Perhaps maybe Esther can take care of some of the questions.
Thank you, Sam. There's just one more question which is related to you.
Okay.
Is that in response to the challenges, how have schools and teachers responded in order to get more buy-in and acceptance from parents and community for TVCs in the classroom?
Okay. Okay. Earlier I mentioned international school. Now, in fact, I will think there must be some international schools in all the countries or economies that you belong to. They actually are doing a very good job in implementing TVCs, helping kids to develop the non-academic skills. Earlier, I mentioned an example that in quite a few international schools, actually there's no exam, 0 exam, like for the case for my daughter. No exams, as compared to a local school. There are lots and lots of exams. My goodness, and many kids that go into local school are telling me that they really want to use the thing called reading battle earlier, but they find that they've been pressurized by too many homeworks, and so they really struggle to find time to do things that they like, that they actually can learn a lot more effectively. Okay, now, so besides learning from international schools, I think teachers can try, or educators can try to work with university professors, since they all, or at least some of them, will have interest to do research on 21st century skills, and then it's easier to get buy-in if teachers can work with university professors who have sufficient knowledge to implement or to do research regarding 21st century skills. And then once teachers can see some good examples, some success, how TVC can be implemented successfully in local schools in your country, and then you can probably get buy-in from other teachers as well.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, then again, there's one last question. I missed to see it. The question is, has there been a study in university freshmen, both faculty member and student, and which of the soft skills they found needful, useful, yet lacking?
Okay. Some studies by myself or by my colleagues have been about the non-academic skills for university students. So we are talking about things like collaboration skills, social skills, skills in working with others, and also personal skills. And so these are quite close to UNESCO's TVCs. And now why this important is because many employers are complaining that many university graduates, although they get good grades from courses, but actually they have very low abilities. So in short, they call it high grades but low abilities. And that's why in order to help university students to develop high abilities, they exactly need to develop TVC skills. And for those who are really interested, maybe you can send me an email, and then I can send you the instrument or results that we've collected so far.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Sam. So we have now a couple of questions for Dr. Esther. Esther, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, okay, I'll read out the questions. I just sent you also. Are there any countries where a standardized national assessment of TVC is conducted, going beyond classroom-based and school-based assessment?
Right. Look, I'm not aware of any countries that are doing this in a standardized way at the moment. Having said that, I'm aware that in the Philippines, of course, and Ramya mentioned earlier on that I do quite a lot of work there. In the Philippines, we have developed some tests of 4 different skills, and that development has happened through BEA, the Bureau of Educational Assessment, that is part of the Department of Education here in the Philippines. And at the moment, those tests have not been used nationally, but they have been developed. So they've been piloted over the last 18 months with a view to using them more widely in the country. So that's been a very interesting approach that has been used there, that if we look at, say, something, a skill like problem solving, for example, what the team did from BEA as well as from the Bureau of Curriculum Development here in the Philippines, what they did was they did an audit of the curriculum and identified opportunities across 4 different subjects where problem solving was a skill that wouldn't necessarily come to bear. So I can't remember offhand what they were, but let's just say they were history and maths and language and geography or something like that. And so the tests were constructed using a problem scenario that could equally be used across those 4 different subject areas. So in other words, you pose the problem, but you cloak the problem in the different curricular areas. So you basically have an identification of a problem in maths or in history, which actually calls upon the same actual processes that need to be enacted by a student. And so what we did there was develop a test of, I think it's about 100 items or so, that can be given to students where we can identify then the degree to which their problem-solving abilities are constant across the different curricular areas, because that's what we're looking for skills. We're looking for the degree to which students can apply a particular cognitive or social process across different scenarios or in different contexts. So that's one country that has moved ahead in trying to do this quite systematically. There may, of course, be other countries that have done it, but I'm not aware of any that are doing it at national level. If we think, though, about international large-scale assessments, then obviously some of the IEAA and the OECD large-scale assessments have been looking at skills like problem-solving, collaborative problem-solving, and digital literacies and things like that.
Yeah, thank you. One more question. I understand that there has been a great degree of variance in terms of TVC in different countries, interpretation, conceptualization, and operation, etc. Whatever. With this in mind, what's your opinion and observation about the emerging efforts and intention to assess TVC cross-nationally? For example, in regional and international learning assessment initiatives such as Southeast Asia Primary Learning Metrics, or PISA 2018?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Nadia, can you just
read the whole thing
Repeat the
again?
actual question there?
Sure.
Not the whole thing,
Oh,
but
no,
just
the question is
punchline, I
okay.
think.
With this in mind, what's your opinion or observation about the emerging efforts or intentions to assess TVC cross-nationally? For example, in the regional or international learning assessment initiatives, such as CPLM or PISA 2018.
I see. Okay. Look, I think that this is a question of opinion rather than anything else.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that comparisons cross-nationally on skills assessment are particularly useful. I think that we can see the use of international, or the movement of international large-scale assessments moving in these areas as useful for now, because it's highlighting the issue and making psychometricians, test and scale developers really trying to think about how do we go about the assessment. But if we think about the penetration of international large-scale assessment results back down into the classroom, that penetration is not very solid or significant or deep. I think what we need to be looking at much more is how do we assess in the classroom in a way that helps the teachers to teach the skills. So I think that as we move into really changing the focus of education a little bit, we should not fall into the same traps that we have in the past. And this goes a little bit to something that was mentioned earlier when Sam was asking a question too about the possibility to fail. When we're looking at skills development, there should be no such concept as a possibility to fail. Everybody is somewhere along the spectrum of skills. They might be fairly low, they could be middle, or they could be high, but you don't actually fail at a skill in the same way as you can fail in getting the correct answer to a matter of fact. So when we look at really large scale assessment, I'm not sure of the value to countries at the moment of comparing countries. I think it's much more a matter of working within country or within region to try just to help ourselves understand how we can go about the assessment in a way that produces results that can be meaningful to the teachers and meaningful to the students in a way that can help them to develop the skills. Because that's where we're coming from with this movement into a breadth of skills agenda, that we think this is something that students need to learn. Therefore, we need to make sure that all of our assessment devices are to that goal. And whether comparisons across countries are salient to that goal, I doubt.
Yeah, thank you. So one more question, probably the last one. So Dr. Esther, what do you suggest for places where global citizenship education is not yet on the curriculum? Where can it be embedded besides civics education?
Right. Oh, look, I think if you look at the definitions of global citizenship, you'll see that it covers almost everything we want our students to learn. So if you look at the Global Education's 2030 agenda and the definition of global citizenship, one of the most recent coming out of the OECD talks about how we have, values, knowledge, skills, attitude, and all of these combine to form competencies in global citizenship. So really, global citizenship seems to me sort of a big amorphous mass. So I think what we need to be doing is thinking about what are some of the components of that we can focus on more easily in the classroom, rather than trying to think, hey, how do we develop a global citizen? Maybe we need to be thinking about, well, we do want someone who can solve problems. We want somebody who is aware of others and can communicate with others. We need somebody who can work with other people, somebody who can look at things from a different perspective and be innovative in their solutions. So I think if we start bringing it back down to some of these more discrete skills, it's much easier to see where we can embed those skills in a curriculum. So rather than say to a country, oh, you've got to move in a global citizenship or global competency direction, I think it might be more powerful to talk about the skills that countries can already see are absolutely relevant to them, like problem solving, working together when you need more than one person to solve a problem. So you have to have collaboration, have to have perspective taking. In terms of encouraging countries to take these directions, I think based on the evidence that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, many countries are moving in this direction. I realise that for some countries it might for the moment be lip service, that they're putting it up there, and it does seem to me that the big issue for all of us is moving from those aspirations and those ambitions through to the actual implementation. And so that's why I'm saying that to work as a region on this might be one way of supporting countries that are not quite sure about how you take that next step. So I think that being involved in the sort of work that we're planning from 2017 to 2019 is one way to go. You mentioned CPLM before, and even though I might not think cross-country comparisons are useful, the concept of CPLM is a very useful one, because the concept of it is that you get the participating countries to work together so that they understand a particular approach to assessment. And that building of models around assessment is absolutely brilliant. And it's more of that I think could be useful, of getting different countries working together on these skills development, because when you're working with people who are in your own community, and talking about the countries within the Asia Pacific being within a community, then I think it's a lot easier to make strides than to be incredibly aspirational and and find it difficult to know how to make the next move.
Yeah, thank you, Esther. So, Ramya, would you like to join us? Or...
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much, Esther, and also to Sam, who I think has already left us. But I'm afraid that we're going to have to wrap up actually for today, because we've actually run a little bit over the time. But obviously it was a very rich discussion, and I see that there's still some questions that are coming in. We can certainly convey those to Sam and Esther after the webinar, but we'll formally conclude for now. So thank you very much to all of you who joined us for this conversation. As mentioned before, we'll actually be sending the 2 presentations to all of those who registered after we finish up today. So you'll have the presentations. You can also download a copy of the report on assessment of transversal competencies, which, as I mentioned, we published in December of last year on the UNESCO Bangkok website. We will make sure to also send a link to that along with the presentations. And lastly, as Esther mentioned, so this work is certainly not finished. Rather, it's just beginning in terms of the study that we did looking at 9 countries of the region. But I think it really just scratched the surface, and there's much deeper that we can go on this issue. So as Esther said, we're going to continue to work together and really leverage the platform that NEQMAP is, in terms of being a regional network that is now covering a number of different countries throughout the Asia Pacific. So the next phase of work, as Esther alluded to, will very much focus on working together collectively to gain a better understanding of how some of these different skills and competencies develop, and then how we can support assessment in terms of looking at tools to support teachers, or perhaps looking more from a national perspective. So this is really just the beginning in terms of this work. And so for those of you who are interested, we would certainly love to keep you informed about the evolutions of all of this, and to have your input and your feedback in terms of the next steps. Those of you who are formally part of institutions that are NEQMAP members will anyway be receiving information about this, but we would welcome any others to also keep in touch with us and to follow along on our website and our social media to get the latest updates. So with that, thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you to Esther, to Sam, to my colleagues in Bangkok, and to all of you. And we hope that we'll have another opportunity to come together very soon for another NEQMAP webinar. Thank you.